The Armed Services Committee meets today to consider the nomination of Mr. Richard V. Spencer to be Secretary of the Navy. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge the tragedy in Mississippi yesterday, the 16 service members who lost their lives in the crash of a Marine Corps KC-130 from Cherry Point, North Carolina, reminds us that these brave men and women put themselves in harm's way every day at home and abroad, in training and in combat in service to our nation. We're all keeping their families in our hearts and prayers. Mr. Spencer, we thank you for joining us this morning. We also welcome your family and friends with us today. As is our tradition, at the beginning of your testimony, we invite you to introduce those who are joining you. It's the standard for this committee to ask certain questions in order to exercise its legislative and oversight responsibilities. It's important that this committee and other appropriate committees of the Congress be able to receive testimony, briefings, and other communications of information. So, I'm going to ask you the standard questions we ask every nominee before this committee. Have you adhered to applicable laws and regulations governing conflicts of interest?
I have.
Will you ensure that your staff complies with deadlines established for requested communications, including questions for the record and hearings?
I will.
Will you cooperate in providing witnesses and briefers in response to congressional requests?
I will.
Will those witnesses be protected from reprisal for their testimony or briefings?
They will.
Do you agree, if confirmed, to appear and testify upon request before this committee?
I do.
Do you agree to provide documents, including copies of electronic forms of communication in a timely manner when requested by a duly constituted committee, or to consult with the committees regarding the basis for any good faith delay or denial in providing such documents?
I do.
Have you assumed any duties or undertaken any actions which would appear to presume the outcome of the confirmation process?
I have not.
Thank you. The next Secretary of the Navy will assume this role during a time of immense importance for U.S. sea power. I note the presence of one of our most distinguished members and dear friend of every member of the committee, Republican and Democrat, and perhaps it would be more convenient for us to hear from Senator Warner before I proceed with my opening statement. Senator Warner, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Reid and members of the committee, particularly Jim Inhofe and Bill Nelson and Mr. Wicker. It is a very humbling experience for me to appear here and on behalf of this distinguished nominee. If I ever reflect on this great committee, I just think about the marvelous traditions it has established for the entirety of the Senate throughout its long existence. And I say to the new members of the committee, I wish you well. And I'm confident as you pursue your careers in life that you will always look back on your membership on this committee as a very special privilege. Because after all, the function of this committee is to provide care for the men and women of the armed forces of the United States, together with their families. Now, I know the chairman is anxious for me to be brief, and I shall be brief, Mr. Chairman, but I'd like to say that on my left is Mr. Spencer, his lovely wife, and they'll be a magnificent team, in my humble judgment, to serve America and to serve the men and women of the armed forces, most particularly the Navy and the Marine Corps. Mr. Spencer has a very interesting and broad career. He's quite adept and knowledgeable on all aspects of finance, not only domestically here in our country, but globally. And together with his other achievements in life, which are manifold, and you've got all the papers before you, but I point out that he served on the Department of Defense Business Board for some 6 years, showing his interest in national security for those years. And then he was chairman of the Marine Corps Heritage Foundation. So he's kept all of his priorities carefully in tow throughout his life. And I would like to say that he achieved something that I always wanted to achieve. Our distinguished chairman got the Navy wings of gold, and he got the Marine Corps wings of gold, and spent his one whole tour, several years, as a pilot of the helicopters at a Rotary. But he did his fixed wing time, I'm sure, before he got there. And he loved the Marine Corps, and he loved the military life, and he looked forward to that day when he might be able to return and become more active. And this is one of the most interesting and wonderful positions in our entire establishment of federal government, is Secretary of the Navy. So I'd like to say that I'm not a stranger to the proceedings we're undertaking, but there is an aspect of this particular confirmation proceeding that I've never encountered before. On his own initiative, he reached out and counseled with 10 secretaries of Navy to ask of them what they thought of the challenges of today, how best he might be able to fulfill those challenges. And we have with us today, Will Ball was one of them, John Dalton, Richard Danzig, Gordon England, John Lehman, Sean O'Keefe, Sean Stackley, who's acting secretary, Jim Webb, Don Winter, and yours truly. And I want to be very careful in my summary, having talked to all of them about this moment where I sort of represent the gang. We do not wish to be presumptuous, so we couch our words in the following sentence, and that is, we believe this fine man and his lovely wife are most worthy of being here today and being given the opportunity to appear before you as you perform your constitutional duty of advise and consent. So with that, I conclude my remarks. Semper Fi, my good friend, you're on your own.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Warner, you bring unique credentials to this body, having served as both Secretary of the Navy and Chairman of this committee. And the members on both sides of the aisle take your words with the utmost seriousness. We thank you for your return. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for the many years that you spent with me, helping me in my responsibilities as a member of this committee. We thank you, sir.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for our long personal friendship. And I recall so well when I became Undersecretary of the Navy, prior to being Secretary, how your father, then Commander-in-Chief, All Forces of Pacific, together with your extraordinary mother, reached out to help me as a young man, very young man, I think I was about the youngest at that time, as I took on these responsibilities in 1969, many years ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Warner. The next Secretary of the Navy will assume this role during a time of immense importance for U.S. sea power. Some of the greatest threats and challenges of the future will be in the maritime domain, and it is critical that our Navy and Marine Corps are prepared to fight and win decisively. The Secretary has broad authority and responsibility for all affairs of the Department of the Navy, including the manning, training, equipping, and maintaining of naval forces, As we heard from the Chief of Naval Operations and Commandant of the Marine Corps last month, their forces face significant readiness shortfalls and the urgent need to grow and modernize. This committee looks forward to hearing how you would address the challenges confronting the Navy and Marine Corps, more than $15 billion in readiness shortfalls and unfunded priorities. Plans to achieve the larger Navy and Marine Corps service leaders say we need, and delivering acquisition programs at cost, on schedule, and with the promised capability. The sad truth is, in recent years, we have not given our sailors and Marines what they need to succeed. As we have asked ever more of them, we have failed in our responsibility to provide them with the necessary resources, training, and equipment. This puts their lives in greater danger every day, and we can waste no time in reversing course. Restoring readiness, rebuilding capacity, and modernizing to regain the technological advantage of our naval forces will require clear vision and strong leadership from the next Navy Secretary. Mr. Spencer, I look forward to discussing your plan to approach these demands if confirmed. This committee is grateful both for your prior service as well as your willingness to serve again. As a U.S. Marine, as a member of the Defense Business Board, you've demonstrated your dedication to this nation. I'm confident that your decades of experience leading large, complex operations and businesses has prepared you to take on this role if you are confirmed. In closing, this committee honors the service and sacrifice of all of our sailors and Marines. Mr. Spencer, we look forward to hearing your testimony about how you plan to lead the Department of the Navy during this crucial time. Senator Reed.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me join you in welcoming Mr. Spencer to the committee, and thank you for your willingness to serve as Secretary of the Navy, and also let me thank your family for the support they provide to you. Let me also recognize Senator Warner. Senator, your example continues to inspire this committee. We'll get there eventually to your level, but we're trying, let me assure you. I, too, want to join the chairman in recognizing and paying tribute to the service members and their families in the Navy and Marine Corps. We are saddened by the loss of life during the recent incident on the USS Fitzgerald and just last evening with the crash of the KC-130 Marine Corps tanker. Our prayers go out to the crews and families of those two units. This accident serves as a humbling reminder of the perils that our service members endure daily, whether they are deployed to combat zones or conducting routine operations. Mr. Spencer, if you are confirmed for this position, you'll be faced with a number of critical issues that confront the Department of the Navy. The Navy and the Marine Corps have historically had to deal with the day-to-day strains of deployment and high operating tempos. With concerns about supporting the readiness of our deployed and non-deployed forces, the next Secretary's efforts in managing improvements in the force and its supporting structure will be critical. As a first priority, it seems to me that the Secretary of the Navy should focus on improving readiness of the existing forces. For example, it seems very short-sighted to me for the Navy to have allowed the diving certifications for the USS Boise to expire, then have to tie that boat to a pier for more than a year when combatant commanders' demand for submarine services are unmet. Our global threat environment dictates an increased need for advanced platforms like the Boise to be utilized for our national security instead of docked due to administrative shortcomings. While readiness is very important, the next Secretary must also confront other challenges that face our Navy. For a number of years, many of us have expressed concern about the size of the Navy fleet and the number of ships we are building each year. Last December, the Chief of Naval Operations released an updated force structure assessment which recommended a total fleet of 355 ships. However, as challenging as it may be to increase the number of ships in the fleet, numbers alone are not enough. This past May, the CNO also released a paper titled The Future Navy, in which he said, in part, more platforms are necessary, but not sufficient. The Navy must also incorporate new technologies and new operational concepts. I echo the CNO's sentiments about modernizing our fleet and operational concepts, but it is a goal that you will find faces many obstacles. By implementing the Packet Commission recommendation years ago, Congress and the Department took the service secretaries out of the chain of command for major defense acquisition programs. The Service Secretary, however, plays a critical role in the budget and requirements decisions that drive the acquisition programs. As we begin procurement funding for the Columbia-class program this year, I believe that the Secretary of the Navy will play an integral role in guiding this critical program. The challenges that the Navy faces are further exacerbated by the budgetary constraints imposed by the Budget Control Act. Left unaddressed, these challenges will limit the Navy's ability to field, train, and equip a modern Navy required to confront the global threats to our country. I look forward to hearing your testimony on how we can modernize our fleet and improve our cost efficiency of our acquisition process. And, Mr. Chairman, thank you for calling this hearing. I look forward to supporting this nomination and working with Mr. Spencer in the future.
Mr. Spencer, welcome. And as I mentioned earlier, if you'd like to introduce members of your family who are here today, please proceed, and so we can interrogate you as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Senator. First, I'd like to thank Senator Warner for his eloquent introduction and his unending service to our country. I'd also like to thank Secretary Mattis for his support and the President for his continuing confidence in nominating me for this position. At this time, I'd also like to introduce my wife, Polly, my daughter, Averill, my son, Pierce, my stepson, Joseph, who are here with me today. I, too, would like to reflect for a minute. The Navy Marine Corps team was struck last night with a tragedy. 15 Marines, 1 sailor perished, and I'd just like us all to keep their loved ones and their families in our thoughts and prayers as we conduct our business today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Reed, members of this committee. 36 years ago, to the month, I was driving through the tomato fields surrounding the landing pads at Marine Corps Air Station Tustin, California. My trusty steed at that time was a beige 1968 VW Bug that carried me out of the gates for the last time as I ended a tour with Marine Helicopter Squadron 161. Headed northbound to the entrance of the Pacific Coast Highway, I can tell you without hesitation that the thought of me sitting before this august group being considered as Secretary of the Navy was not to be found even in the most remotest parts of my mind. However, during those 36 years, I was educated in financial and operational management, increasing in scope as I progressed through my career. The leadership skills developed in the Marine Corps were strengthened and honed through various positions I held in both public and private sector. I was a student and then practitioner of disruptive technology while being respectful of industrial science. The journey from the gates of Tustin to here has, I believe, provided me with the knowledge and the skill set to tackle the issues at hand. It truly is a great honor for me to appear before you seeking the confirmation as the 76th Secretary of the Navy. The honor to be here today is magnified by the current state of play in the world today, which is nothing less than a perfect storm. We've been at war for the past 16 years with the operational tempo of the various conflicts in which we are engaged, denying us the needed time and resources for modernization and maintenance. Add to that the growing requirements generated by the combatant commanders who are facing continually evolving threats from all corners of the globe, and you have a Navy Marine Corps team that has been continually engaged and stretched thin. At the same time, the impact of the Budget Control Act, which gave birth to sequestration, coupled with the inability to produce consistent sources of funding in the form of annual budgets, has produced an environment where, as Secretary Mattis has said, we are no longer managing risk, we are now gambling. We must immediately commence the heavy lifting needed to buttress the effects of the storm in order to build fleet readiness in the near term and to increase the Navy Marine Corps capability and capacity in the near future. Before I answer your questions addressing my ability to lead the Department of the Navy, let me briefly provide you with my views of naval matters. First, people are our most valuable and most expensive resource within the Navy. The Navy Marine Corps team, their families, and their civilian teammates have never failed our nation, and they never will. However, I believe that we are failing them through such actions as the Budget Control Act and continuing resolutions. Due to their determination and patriotism, they have and continue to do more with less. I also believe their diligence, attention to duty, and commitment to putting the nation and their teammates above themselves has not been reciprocated in all instances. If confirmed, I do not want to stifle their can-do attitude. I do not want to do that in the least. But I also do not want to send the signal that we're taking it for granted. It is not the Secretary of the Navy, nor the Department of Defense, nor Congress that is bearing the brunt of this situation. Rather, it is the sailors, Marines, our citizen soldiers in the reserves, and their families who are squarely shouldering the burden. All the while, there's a growing demand from the private sector to employ our sailors and Marines, which puts more pressure on readiness and retention. We must work together to find the resources and the solutions necessary to make the Navy a preferred career. Second, I believe that that U.S. naval superiority is a cornerstone for the foundation of American security and global stability. A maneuverable, forward-deployed Navy Marine Corps team is an integral element that increases the options available for a whole-of-government solution to situations around the globe. In order to support that mission, we must address the capability and capacity of our fleet forces. I believe the nuclear triad is one of America's more effective threat deterrents, and the Navy owns the most survivable leg of that weapon system. Therefore, it owns the task to maintain and modernize its component of the triad. As the Navy steps out to act upon the intent of the President and the Secretary of Defense, it must do so with a renewed rigor and effectively apply the resources granted by you, the Congress, with an enhanced sense of urgency. The organization must analyze all its existing systems and platforms to extract all additional efficiencies, while at the same time it incorporates the advantages provided by both internal research and development and advancements developed by the private sector. Urgency must be the theme as we enhance our readiness and existing capabilities in order to fight beyond our present capacity, all the while addressing the future build-out of the fleet. Finally, I believe the organizational construct needed to deliver the aforementioned goals is one that is flat, lean, and agile. It is an organization where those who face and manage critical situations have the ability to make decisions with the full understanding of the responsibility and accountability associated with the outcome. My business career has been well served by the credo that accountability starts at the top and then permeates throughout the organization. I've also learned that each member of an effective organization must be empowered to put forth changes that will enhance its operational efficiencies. To adapt in the face of competition, the whole Navy team must be engaged. If I am confirmed, I would use a tagline borrowed from the Department of Homeland Security and that I've paraphrased as my guiding principle to change the organization. If you see something, suggest something. In closing, let me say that I do not come before you with a preconceived agenda to address the issues facing the Navy and the Marine Corps. I come before you ready to expeditiously assess the current situation, develop the tools needed to enhance its ability to fight, and to deliver on the responsibilities of the Office of the Secretary of the Navy as delineated in Title 10. If confirmed, I will accomplish this by coordinating the efforts of the Chief of Naval Operations, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, the Secretariat, and the senators and members of Congress through leadership that is grounded in transparency and accountability. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Jack, do you want to say anything else?
No, sir.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Spencer. I was just on a trip with several of my colleagues, Senator Warren, Senator Perdue, Senator Graham, Senator Whitehouse, and among other places that we spent 4th of July, as I have for many years in Kabul with and outside of Kabul with the men and women serving in the military, among a number of events that we do with them for 4th of July. One was to do a town hall meeting with a large number of men and women who are in uniform. Senator Graham, as happens once in every decade, asked a very astute question. He asked how many in the room were there for more than the first time in Afghanistan. Majority raised their hands. He said, how many have been here more than twice? Majority raised their hands. And he said, how many have been here 3 times? A significant number raised their hands. In other words, to me, it was something that was a graphic demonstration of the incredible burden that our active duty military has been bearing over the last 15 or 16 years. They're brave, they're proud, they're the best maybe we've had in a long, long time, but they're not fully equipped and they're not fully trained and they're not given the authority and responsibility that they need in order to win this conflict. The fact is, in Afghanistan, we're not winning. We're not winning. And no less than our military commander in Afghanistan will tell you that as a fact. That has to be turned around. We cannot ask these young men and women to keep going over there with a strategy that in order to defend a ANA, Afghan National Army garrison, in order to defend itself, it has to have permission from somebody in the White House on the National Security Council staff. I'm exaggerating a bit, but the fact is that if you ask any of these young men and women who have been there and there and there, they will tell you that they can win this fight, but they've got to have both the equipment and the authority to do so. It's not that they're not well led. They are. It's not that they're not capable. They are. But it is a don't lose strategy, which is epitomized by the former president's speech at West Point, where he said, we're going to surge and we're going to increase the number of troops there and we're going to win. And by the way, we're leaving on a certain date. You're Mr. Baghdadi and you hear that. I think the conclusions you draw are obvious. Now, we've got ships that are stuck at the pier, 2 nuclear submarines that have been sitting at the pier for over a year because of lack of spare parts. 60% of our F-16s are grounded. The list goes on and on and on and on. And it's got to do with the Budget Control Act, one of the greatest acts of cowardice ever enacted by the Congress of the United States. How serious do you think the problem is, and what do you think we need to do?
Senator, I believe it's probably one of the most serious issues that we are facing right now for national security. The Budget Control Act has wreaked havoc with our readiness, the impact on the lives of our sailors and Marines. Doing the office calls that I had with you all, I find great comfort and excitement in the fact that everyone is leaning in on this issue. There's a lot of heavy lifting that has to be done. There's a lot of cheese moving that has to be done. We have to streamline processes. We have to address capabilities. And I believe that is number one on the issue. If you look at my priorities, they're people, capabilities, and process to address these and apply the resources that we have for the down payment on readiness and move forward into building out the fleet.
Well, on your third one, the process, probably the greatest source of frustration to members of this committee on both sides is the continued cost overruns associated with acquisition. A few years ago, in 2013, I asked a former chief of naval operations who was responsible for the $2 billion cost overrun on the USS Gerald R. Ford. He said he didn't know. When I asked a former Air Force chief of staff about the F-35 cost overruns, he didn't think anyone had been fired. What are we going to do about this now that 2 years in a row now we have held people accountable? We've put the service chiefs in the mix and made them responsible. We have taken a number of measures to hold people responsible. But how is it we've reached a point where you can have a $2 billion cost overrun on an aircraft carrier, one ship, $2 billion cost overrun, and no one is responsible?
Senator, my career has been steeped in accountability, and I can tell you right now that the accountability starts right here. The way that we address this is through behavioral management. You reward positive events, and you have other events or other tools at your disposal to take care of people who aren't, or projects that aren't performing. And you make this very transparent. I'm going to be coming before you all asking for resources. But I also have to have my decks clean to make sure those resources and the treasures of the American taxpayer are put forth in a fiduciarily prudent manner.
Do you know of anyone who's been fired from their job because of cost overruns?
Not yet, Senator.
Senator Reid.
I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Spencer, again, for your service already and your commitment to serve the Navy. You reflected in your opening statement the critical nature of the triad and the fact that the Navy is the leading edge of that with the Columbia-class program. And the CNO has called it the Navy's top modernization priority. I assume you feel the same way?
Most definitely, Senator.
And I think in spirit of the conversation we've had with the chairman is that one of the things we want to do is make sure that program stays on schedule and on budget or below budget. Both General Dynamics and Ingalls have done a remarkable job with the Virginia class, keeping them ahead of schedule with each new boat and making sure the budget's sound. We want that same tradition, and I know you want that same tradition with Columbia.
Most definitely, Senator.
Thank you. As I mentioned before, not only do we need more ships, we need new operational concepts and new technologies. And I wonder if you've given any thoughts in your discussions with the former secretaries or with the CNO about what areas you see that you could collaborate with the CNO on.
I have, Senator, starting out with just the acquisition process itself. I think if you heard what I laid out in my priorities, we now have, I believe, we did a study at the Defense Business Board, 32 plus layers of people needed to sign off on an acquisition process. And that did not involve major platforms. We have to allow the people who have the education and the intelligence to make acquisitions and to face off problems to provide the solutions. And they have to know and be responsible for the outcome and be accountable for it. And I think that's one of the biggest steps forward we make right off the bat.
Are there any technologies that you're, given your extensive experience in the Defense Business Board, any technologies that you think could be sort of break the mold and, a leap ahead approach?
Most definitely, Senator. I mean, people have asked, what do you think of the 355-ship Navy? And I said, it is a great goal to have. I can't tell you what the construct of that would be sitting here today because I think unmanned, both below the water, on the water, and in the air, is an area we're just beginning to chip away at, and that's going to provide some great yield for us.
Thank you. There's another aspect of this whole technology that is to operate more efficiently, and one of the major constraints going back to the age of steam is fuel. So energy efficiency from an operational standpoint would seem to be a critical aspect. Are you going to continue the efforts of the Navy? And they've done some remarkable things in terms of alternate energy, fuels, et cetera.
It is, I believe, if confirmed, my responsibility as the Secretary of the Navy to explore any and all avenues that provide us longer legs, less of a tether to fuel sources. And that goes across the board for technologies also.
We've all indicated I don't know what the right word is, the discomfort, if you will, with the Budget Control Act. But I think it's reached a point now where our, complaints are important. But do you think it would be helpful if the President made a major address to the country and a major proposal of how to resolve this? I don't recall very much of his comment on the BCA.
I believe we all have to come together as a country to address this. It is devastating what it is doing to us. If we look back at when it was created, it was, in my eyes, a bluff card that was to bring everyone together, and all of a sudden the bluff was called and BCA was put into place. We all have to get behind this. I look forward to working with all of you and doing whatever we can to educate the American voters as to what is going on with the BCA and how it's affecting us.
Well, I concur. Again, the bully pulpit, there's one, well, at least one major one, and that I think we need some direction, some guidance, not just exhortation to do better, but it's a plan to actually get it done. So
Agreed.
I thank you, Mr. Secretary, and as I said in my comments, I look forward to working with you.
Thank you, Senator.
Whatever happened to the 1968 beige Volkswagen?
Senator, I wish I'd keep it. It'd probably be worth more than the car I'm driving now.
You know, one of the things that I've been very proud of our uniforms is the fact that they're, for the first time, at least in my years that I've spent here, both in the House and the Senate, they're talking about the threat that's so real out there. And you and I talked, and by the way, thank you for the time that you gave. Not just me, but everyone I've talked to has had a long visit with you, and we all know pretty much where you're coming from. And I mentioned this to you in my office, that it's the first time that I've seen the uniforms come out and talk about this unprecedented threat that we're facing right now and why it's a threat. And we had when we stand on the stump and talk about this, we don't have the credibility of someone in uniform. And so it goes all the way up to the secretary level. And I'm sure that you're going to be talking about that. You're not going to shy away from the reality that the level of threat that we have. The news reports that North Korea has successfully tested an ICBM capable of ranging to the United States. Coupled with a nuclear program, it now poses an imminent threat to the United States. In one of our hearings, we had General Stewart, the DIA director, going as far as to say it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So I would hope that you would elaborate as much as some of the rest of them are in joining in, because we're not going to get the attention. We all are talking about sequestration. We're talking about the problems that we're having. And we remember when, 1964, that 52% of the entire budget was defending America. It's been steadily going down since that time. So it's going to take a kind of a resurgence of people at the top, letting them know that times are not the way they used to be. Right now, we have a mentally deficient individual running a country that is totally unpredictable. We've had hearing after hearing, and that's the one thing that the top people in the military say, that that's totally unpredictable. So at our subcommittee that we had in January, going back to January, Admiral Moran said that the Navy has a readiness debt that will take years to pay down. So in your advanced policy question response, you wrote, our highest priority is to address the fleet-wide readiness by strengthening and leveraging our capabilities. Is there anything you want to say about that now that hasn't already been said in response to the questions from my predecessors?
Well, Senator, I will tell you that shying away from issues at hand is not something that I do well. If I am confirmed, I truly believe the whole focus of my work would be the pointy end of the spear.
Yeah,
and we're going to stand up and make sure that not only working with you all here in this chamber, but going out into America and letting Americans know what the real issue is.
Okay, I'd like to ask you a question on shipyards and depots. The Navy's recent aviation readiness challenges have been well documented. As the chairman said, we have, 62% of our F-18s are unavailable due to maintenance problems. And, how do we solve this? We're looking into the future, and we're looking right now at a problem that's there today. Do you have any ideas on the first thing you're going to do? And I also want to mention the whole idea of maintaining an organic capability. I remember when I was first elected, we talked about is an arbitrary 50-50. And I thought, surely we can do better than that. But no, we're still 50-50. And quite frankly, I think it's worked pretty well. What do you think about the handling of this, the depots, and about our organic capability?
Senator, it's a very interesting a balancing act, I believe, that we have to address. When it comes to industrial capability, I can separate aviation and shipbuilding, and I'll address shipbuilding first, where we have lesser of numbers of providers. I don't say we glad hand people at all, but industrial science says that the most efficient way to produce is to have a clear line of sight to resources. And in this chamber, I believe we can address that. We have to work outside the chamber, I think, to work with some of our providers to ensure that they are providing us the best long-term sustainable relationship we can have to deliver equipment in the most cost-effective, quick manner we can.
Yeah. And lastly, I'd just say that you addressed the 355 ship issue, and I'm sure you've given some thought to what it would be the appropriate personnel in strength to for a fleet of 355. Looking into the future, I would assume that you'd be starting to address that now while we're addressing the great threat that currently faces us.
Yes, Senator, if we take the full gambit of what's available to us to tackle the 355 ship goal, we should be thinking outside the box. We should be thinking possibly bringing things out of the ready reserve. We should be looking at ways to construct better, faster, cheaper. We'll be looking at a frigate down the road. All of this capacity increase will require manning. So there will be some numbers that have to be adjusted going forward for end strength.
Sure. Well, I'm looking forward to working with you.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Spencer, welcome to the committee. I think you'll be pleased to know that an amendment was adopted during our recent markup of the defense bill sponsored by myself and Senator Cotton, affectionately known as the King-Cotton Amendment, that calls for the unconditional repeal of the Budget Control Act. So this committee is on record, and I think in following up on Senator Reed's questions, it would be very helpful if you could, in your capacity as Secretary, assuming you're confirmed, to work with the administration to impress upon them the importance of this issue and the really critical role that it is playing in undermining the readiness of our forces. I commend that to you as a suggestion. You use the term disruptive technology, and then later on you mentioned in your work on the Business Defense Board that there were 32 layers of the acquisition process. How in the world do you incorporate disruptive technology having to go through 32 layers of approvals?
It dies fairly early, probably on layer 2, Senator. So you have to actually address, as I call it, the behavioral management of how we're going to think and act in our actions. If, in fact, you provide people the latitude to make decisions and the span of control actually expands and hierarchy contracts. But again, you have to tie this to accountability and responsibility.
Well, I hope, as in following up on the chairman's questions and his concern about this issue, I would urge you to get together with your colleagues and step back and really look at the acquisition process in a fresh way, given the imperative of technological incorporation in a speedy way, and think about how do we get on a war footing when we were making destroyers one every 2 weeks and airplanes one every 15 or 20 minutes, as we were during World War II. How do we get a sense of urgency into this process? And that, to me, is, I think you'd be a great person to lead that, given your experience.
Senator, my analogy that I've been using just in talks prior to this meeting is that we're looking at October of 1957 and Sputnik has just flown over our head. The technological gap and our production gaps are shrinking compared to our one-on-one competitors, and we need to get a sense of urgency, get on the forward foot, and use all resources available to us. This is what makes this job exciting in my eyes.
And one of the lessons from that era, for example, President Kennedy saying we're going to put a man on the moon in 10 years, is to have goals, even though they may be audacious, but to have specific goals and say this is what we're going to achieve. A different line of question. Do you have any idea of the retention rate in the Navy? What our loss rate is of these highly trained sailors and Marines?
I don't know the exact number, Senator, but I know it's of concern.
Well, it seems to me that one might be an area of rich usefulness to investigate, because if we can retain someone rather than recruiting and training new people, that would be saving taxpayers' dollars, and it would also be retaining the expertise that we need. I commend that to you as an area of focus.
Another great area of excitement in my eyes, Senator, as I stated in my opening statement, the human capital section of our budget is our most expensive and our most valuable. And we have to work and extract the best practices from the private sector in areas on how we can keep people and make the Navy the preferred
And every
career.
pilot and mechanic we can retain is one that we don't have to spend $1 million to train. Final area, we talked a bit about procurement and cost overruns. As we've had multiple hearings before this committee on the Ford, on the F-35, on other programs, one of the things that comes through is trying to build things before they're fully designed and before the design is mature and tested. We just approved a 15-ship multi-year for the DDG Flight 3, which the Navy wants, we want, everybody wants. The question is that design fully mature? Not one has yet been built. And I hope that's an area that you will look at in your work. I, representing a state that builds these ships, want them built as soon as possible, but I also don't want to repeat some of the mistakes that we've seen with the Ford and the F-35.
Senator, on behalf of the Navy, I'd like to thank your efforts, Senator Collins' efforts, everyone's efforts in this building for providing us an increased capacity. If you would allow me the time to spool up and get up to speed on the direct issue at hand, I look forward to coming back to you with a granular answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Spencer, for joining us today. I truly do appreciate it and your testimony. I'd like to start by just asking you some simple yes or no questions, if I may. Do you commit to cutting wasteful spending and making it a priority?
Yes.
Do you commit to working with me to combat and prevent military sexual assault and retaliation in the Navy and the Marine Corps?
Most definitely.
Will you provide me with advance notice should changes to the gender integration policies be considered?
I will.
Do you commit to upholding an unbiased and transparent approach throughout the acquisition process?
I do.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I appreciate the fact that you took some time last month to sit down and visit with me about the needs of the Navy and the Marine Corps. And one thing that I was very encouraged about is the fact that you said, in order to move the needle, we're going to have to perspire a little bit. And I don't want to speak for other members in Congress, but I will say that I think here on this committee, we are ready to perspire a little bit and get things moving. So if you could, if you are confirmed, how do you envision the department's relationship with Congress, and what is your plan to enhance that relationship, and how do we work together to move that needle?
Senator, from the time I left the Marine Corps and entered private sector, I have reported to either, quote unquote, my bosses, and then as I progressed down my career and ran companies, I still reported to a board of trustees or a board of directors or an executive committee. That's the way I've been trained. It works the best. It's been proven to work the best. I look to you all as the board of directors. You are my quote-unquote partners in this, senior partners, I agree, and I look for you for guidance and direction. We're going to have to work together in lockstep to tackle the problems that we have. We're going to be asking for a tremendous amount of resources. We're going to be moving a lot of cheese. We're going to be trying to streamline an organization all simultaneously. We might fall off the bicycle every now and then. I will be completely transparent and tell you when we've fallen off the bicycle, and hopefully tell you before we do, but I mean, I want to manage expectations in an open, transparent manner.
I appreciate that very much. And as you know, we did talk a little bit about this, but I'm sure you know that our air crews continue to experience physiological episodes in high-performance aircraft, the F-22, the T-45, F-18, and now the F-35, and yet we still haven't found a fix for that. And a few weeks ago, the Air Force announced it was testing sensors for the F-35 Alpha that actually monitor pilots' inhale, exhale gases and automatically activate emergency oxygen if there is a problem. This is something that I've recommended to both the Air Force and the Navy leaders in past hearings, and so I'm very pleased that they are finally taking action. If you are confirmed, do you commit to finding solutions to this problem? And how would you ensure that these solutions are shared across aircraft and service branches so that we don't repeatedly see the same costly problems undermining our warfighting capabilities?
I will commit to you, Senator, it will be a top priority. To address the second part of your question, our studies at the Defense Business Board, one of the things that became readily apparent, at least in my career on the board, was the building is an amazing problem-solving machine. Some of the problems that result from the problem solving is no one either sunsets the solution or they don't actually share the solution amongst the building. It's fairly siloed. I believe that working with my fellow service secretaries, if confirmed, that is one of our key issues, is to start sharing best practices.
Very good. And finally, in my remaining time, we've talked a little bit about the number of ships, and I guess I'm not so concerned about the number of ships, just to ensure that those platforms are doing what they should be doing. But the types of ships are important as well, and making sure that we have an optimal Navy, and a Navy that will also support our Marine Corps. We know that the Marine Corps has been playing a critical role, most often in an infantry-type role. We see them in the desert quite frequently, but amphibious ships seem to be an afterthought. Can you just explain to me what your direction might be in making sure that amphibious ships are included in the discussion when it comes to the number and type of ships that we have?
Most definitely, Senator. If you look at what the Navy Marine Corps team is inherently, it's our forward deployed force. And to affect that forward deployment in the most effective manner, we have to have the amphibious ships for the Marine Corps.
Okay, thank you for your time. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Mr. Spencer. I applaud you for your nomination, congratulate you for it. You are very qualified for this position. I look forward to supporting you, and my friend John Warner's support for you didn't dissuade me from my initial inclination. So I look forward to working together with you. Before I ask you a question or two, I just want to put on the record a concern I have. As Secretary of the Navy, you will set a tone, and one of the tones you have to set is that everybody who comes before us is scrupulously candid in answering questions. At the most recent hearing of the Sea Power Subcommittee, a public hearing that we held just within the last couple of weeks, I asked Admiral Lesher a question. There had been a Bloomberg article about the President's budget coming to us with funding for a second LCS. And the Bloomberg article that came out in the 19th or 20th of June said that part of the funding for the second LCS was going to come through a $325 billion reduction of funding for aircraft carrier overhaul. I asked Admiral Lesher this question in that public hearing. I'm a big LCS fan, but my understanding from the article is part of the funding for that second LCS is going to be reducing aircraft carrier overhaul by $300 million. Is that accurate? And if that's so, give me context as to why that's a good idea and what it would mean. His answer, Admiral Lesher, yes, sir, I won't speculate on what will be in the OMB submission to you, but I will tell you that what you just cited is inaccurate. It would not be a source coming out of aircraft overhaul. Are you familiar with the Bloomberg piece that he just referenced? And so as far as you know, is that not an accurate article? Admiral Lesher, correct. That was his testimony to me. I was very surprised just a week after the hearing to get the President's budget submission, June 29, and $325 million is being moved from aircraft carrier reactor to support a second LCS. I think that's exactly the question I asked him. He told me that I didn't, that the money wasn't coming from that and that the article was inaccurate. And I've yet to get an explanation for why he testified to that. We're all big boys on this committee. We're big boys and girls. We're used to getting answers, and some answers we like and some answers we don't like, but we do depend on getting candid answers. And I hope that that will be a tone that you will set as Secretary of the Navy for all witnesses who would appear before the committee, that they would not try to hide the ball or play semantic games with us, that they would endeavor to answer the questions that we have.
Senator, in my eyes, we can't afford to do that. So I will support transparency and accountability. It's going to be the tone set at the top.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And if the tone is set at the top, that message will be very clear, I'm sure. 355-ship Navy, I just want to ask you about this, because we did an amendment in the NDAA process to state as a concept that this committee supports it. I think it would be a good thing. You talked about grappling with what the ship mix is, and let me just talk about two aspects of what it would mean. 355 ships, that's a number, but surface, underwater, manned, unmanned. I mean, there's a lot of work to do to determine if we're to be at 355, what the right ship mix would be, correct?
Correct.
And then the second issue is it's not just about shipbuilding. I mean, to the extent that we're talking about ships, we're talking about personnel. To the extent we're talking about aircraft carriers, we're talking about air wings. Talk a little bit about, so we can think about what this commitment might mean down the road for our committee as authorizers. What are some of the bigger questions in addition to just the numbers of ships that we're going to have to grapple with together with you if we try to reach that goal?
Senator, to address the second of my priorities, which is capability. I agree with you. The 355 is a good number for people to focus on. Do we know exactly what the mix is? I think since we're talking out a decade, we might not know, and we shouldn't know right now because we have evolving technologies. What I will tell you is that whether it's a 355 ship or not, what we also ought to get our head around is, can we have a capacity number but have a capability that's even greater than that? So have the capability of a 355 that might be a 300-ship Navy. And I'm just speculating now, but that's the concept that I would like to work with you all on, is where we go for our capabilities, because that's where the punch is. And if, in fact, technologies allow us to have different platforms, some that we might not even know of right now that will develop in 5 years, we should keep our eyes and ears open to that. And I look forward to working with all of you in the chamber here on those type of issues.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Spencer, congratulations on your nomination, and thank you for accepting the call of duty of your country once again. I want to associate myself with the remarks of Senator King about the amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act on the Budget Control Act. The Budget Control Act must be repealed. It has not worked. It has not restrained spending, and it will not in the future. I think we all know exactly what will happen if it goes forward. We'll have a continuing resolution in September. We'll have some two-year budget that doesn't restrain spending in November, and then we'll have an omnibus in December. And we'll have another omnibus in December of 2018. Then the whole thing will be started over again in 2019 and 2020. All for a bill that no one, from Senator Fisher to my right and Senator Donnelly and to his left, voted for. 112th Congress was not the Constitutional Convention, and the Budget Control Act is not the Constitution. My question, just to be clear, is can you build a 350-ship Navy if the Budget Control Act remains in force?
No.
Thank you for that. Is the President's budget request sufficient to build that 350-ship Navy if the Budget Control Act is repealed?
It would depend upon the timeline you would be giving the future Secretary of the Navy as a goal.
Thank you. I have to say, Mr. Spencer, that the morale and welfare of sailors and Marines is of utmost concern for me. Your predecessor displayed what I think is questionable, indeed strange, judgment on some matters that left him as one of the most unpopular service secretaries of the modern era. Just to go through a few of those decisions, he politicized the naming of U.S. Navy ships. He made some very strange changes to the Navy uniform that caused a revolt among female sailors. He publicly dismissed official reports about combat effectiveness of mixed-gender units without even having to read them by his own admission. He dumped the Navy's ratings titles, some of which, like boatswain's mate and gunnery's mate, had been around for 200 years. He's tried to power Navy fleets with unproven, expensive, and inadequate fuel alternatives based on current technology, in some cases at the cost of $28 to the gallon. And he questioned the character and integrity of Marines who dared to disagree with some of these policies. I think it's unfortunate that you've inherited this legacy, and it's going to make it somewhat hard as you start out to restore the credibility of the Secretariat. But do you think making these kind of changes is going to enhance the Navy's ability to deter war and, if necessary, fight and win war?
Senator, I testified before this committee, I believe in 2015, that it was my belief that the Department of Defense, specifically individual services, was not to be a petri dish for social experiments. I totally believe that policy should be developed at the DoD level and then discussed and socialized and deployed and then obeyed. We have to work together, including all our service people to make sure that they are given what they need, whether that be spiritually, whether that be psychologically, whether that be materialistically, to fight forward so readiness is the key and lethality is the product.
Thank you for that answer. I agree. I think pretty much every sailor and Marine that you'll have serving underneath your leadership would agree that our foremost priority has to be to deter our nation's adversaries and fight and win our nation's wars where necessary. I want to turn to a particular matter now in the time I have left, Mr. Spencer. Last month, the Navy revoked the license of a contractor that they had long used to do base security for civilian vendors. The change was sudden and concerning to me. After incidents of shootings and terrorist attacks on military installations, I'm concerned that the Navy is fixing something that isn't broken. Could you please be sure to review the contracting plan for base access and get back to me about why the Navy took this action and what its plans for base security going forward are?
If confirmed, Senator, I will.
I don't want you to do anything that would presume confirmation, even though it seems like a pretty good bet so far this morning. Thank you, Mr. Spencer, again, for your willingness to serve our country.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Spencer, welcome to the committee today. It's an honor for me as the newest member of the committee to be here and to get to meet Senator Warner, who served with such distinction over many years. It was a pleasure. I want to thank you, too, for your willingness to serve, and I want to add my condolences to the families that suffered the tragic loss of the 15 Marines and sailor yesterday. I, too, enjoyed the time we got to spend together in my office. I appreciate your comments on the need to keep a robust industrial base active in order to achieve the 355-ship Navy. We have to have a consistent workflow through our Navy yards. Of course, Oslo's in my state, but there are many others around the country who are facing the same situation. Let me ask you one question about testimony that Admiral Lesher gave to the Sea Power Committee just 2 weeks ago, I believe, that we must increase our procurement of helicopters like the Seahawk to meet the needs of a much larger presence. And my question is, do you share this view, and can you just simply commit to the committee that, if you're confirmed, that you'll take a close look at our helicopter force structure as we grow our Navy? And I know helicopters are particular interest to you given your previous service to the country.
Senator, I will commit because we have to look at all resources necessary to fight the wars. Yes.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to wish you the best, really, in the time I have as you take on this critical position, assuming your confirmation. And I appreciate your previous comments on sequestration budget caps. I share the concerns of our chairman and my colleagues on the committee about the disastrous way we go about things. As the newest person in the Senate, it's shocking to me. I certainly wasn't here, like most of my colleagues, when the budget Act was passed. So we'll do our job, I hope, to correct that for you going forward. So I want to thank you again for your service, and I look forward to working with you once you're confirmed. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Spencer, first of all, thank you for your service to our country. I did appreciate the opportunity to sit down and to visit with you in our office. I find this the opportunity to visit in advance to be very, very helpful. I'm curious, and I'd like to have you share a little bit of information about the state of our depots. In particular, I've heard anecdotally that the effectiveness of depot-level aviation maintenance is inconsistent across the services. If confirmed, will you commit to exchanging such best practices with other services?
Senator, again, right in the wheelhouse, we have to share best practices. And if confirmed, the mantle that you'll hear coming from the Navy is working with other service secretaries to find out where they are extracting the best efficiencies and what we can adapt. And if, in fact, we are doing something with great efficiency, we will share with the other services, too.
I think this is something which is critical because right now you've got responsibilities for the service of the aviation assets. Some depots seem to have a better handle on how they're doing it than others. Most certainly there are different approaches to having this being done, and I think it would be beneficial for the different services to have established a best practices approach in those areas in which they have similar responsibilities and opportunities to improve. So I appreciate your willingness to move forward in in that type of a process. So thank you for that. In 2010, as part of the Defense Advisory Board, you proposed the closure of DoD commissaries in the United States under the banner of saving taxpayers $1 billion per year. As you know, this measure was never adopted. What was the biggest lesson that you learned about your experience with the restructure proposal?
It was an interesting proposal. I mean, it was an interesting study in that it never became a formal proposal, but it ended up in the Washington Post. What we were working under the banner there was something that the Commandant quotes as quicker, better, faster. If we could provide a service to our uniformed members and retirees that was equal or better at a more efficient manner, more efficient price, why wouldn't we look at it? We had a solution provided by one of the major logistic companies that's in the soft goods business. It was a fascinating experience for me to find out how the building works and how the society works that is the DoD. You have to pace yourself in certain areas, but again, when it comes to if I'm confirmed, I will look everywhere in the Navy under every single rock where we can find efficiencies. And when I've shared with you that we're going to have to work lockstep together with the Senate Armed Service Committee, there's going to be some big boulders we might have to move.
There's a difference between finding efficiencies and simply reducing benefits. And I just want to walk into this a little bit. In light of that 2010 recommendation to restructure the Department of Defense commissary benefits in the United States, what will be your philosophy regarding personnel benefits should you be confirmed by this committee?
Senator, a learning lesson that will give you insight into my thoughts if confirmed as Secretary was more our study on the modernization of the military retirement system. When we rolled that program out, our study out, there was quite a bit of feedback. In fact, one of the veteran service organizations was nice enough to publish my home email and my home phone, and I took 127 phone calls. And it was fascinating. Once you got through anger and frustration and you started talking to people and you came with the following approach. You have $1 to spend on your benefits. Your retirement costs 60 cents, your health care costs 40 cents, your commissary costs 15 cents, your morale and welfare costs 7 cents. Where do you want to spend your dollars? I believe if we can provide a value association for the benefit received and also understand from our service members what they value, I think we can come to some good conclusions without any erosion in benefit performance.
Okay. One last question. Do you agree that the F-35C and its fifth-generation capabilities are needed for the air wing now and into the future?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Spencer, thank you. And I'm sure if you had a Fitbit on for the past couple of weeks, you put on dozens of miles, because I've seen you all over the building. I appreciate you being so accessible. I want to follow up on the F-35 question. In your responses to questions for the record, there was a question asked about directing a reassessment of the Department of Navy's total program procurement for the F-35s. And I'm not sure what precisely was thought about in terms of a reassessment, but you said review, and I think in response to Senator Round's question, you do believe it's a very important part of our arsenal. Can you talk a little bit about what you think a review or reassessment would actually yield?
I believe that when it comes to a critical weapons platform, there ought to be a continual focus on delivery of the actual aircraft, the weapon systems, whatever the case may be. When we make a decision to buy a platform, it's not autopilot after that. My response in that case was that this is a continually ongoing attention to the actual acquisition and the acquisition process itself.
Thank you. I want to go to another response that related to BRAC, and I think that you said that you thought it made sense for us to consider another round in BRAC. Can you think of anything in particular as it relates to within your lanes that a BRAC would actually yield?
Senator, from my, I don't want to call them briefings, but just my knowledge gathering for the past couple of months, I believe the Navy is probably in fairly good shape when it comes to utilization of assets. To the point, if in fact we grow to a 355 ship Navy, you can't give away waterfront property. It's very expensive to get back. In the same token, I believe that we should continually review the value of our assets and our return on investments in infrastructure, just as a case of being.
Thank you. My final question, you mentioned in response to some of Senator Ernst's questions that you view us as a kind of board of directors, and I like that analogy. I've used it myself here. But we know that senior managers, particularly in board meetings, are the best ones will come in and be very direct and forthright with respect to board policies or actions that are making your job more difficult. I want to tie that into the perspiring line of questioning, too. When confirmed, or if confirmed, I intend to support your nomination. What things do you think you've got to come before this board of directors and say we have to change as a matter of policy, as a matter of consistency? We all know that sequestration has to go away. But what more do you really need to put out? Where do you think you're likely to put us out of our comfort zone? You were actually spared, only because I forgot to bring it, the 680-page RFP that I bring over 10 years to define a handgun, next-generation handgun. My guess is as we go through that, some of those a few hundred pages are because we've told you all to do things a certain way. How are you going to help us actually streamline, free up those resources for the right purposes in DOD and, in your case, within the Navy?
Senator, when I originally said that we're going to work together, this is a fine example. Let's take acquisition. If, in fact, we have a large platform weapons program, one of the things that I might propose is that we have the program executive and the program manager stay in place for the first generation of production.
And have their job depend on it?
And have your job depend upon it, but also that kind of flies in the face of up and out. So we're going to have to adjust some situations here on how we promote people and how if we're going to expect this out of them. So yes, coming to you with various situations that you can help us with to clear maneuvering lanes would be greatly appreciated.
Well, I look forward after your confirmation to perhaps you coming back here and coming up with a long list of things that we need to do differently so that your job can be easier to achieve.
Thank you, Senator. I look forward to it if confirmed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witness for being here. And before I begin, I want to join my colleagues in offering my deepest condolences to the families and loved ones of the service members who died in yesterday's crash of a transport and refueling aircraft. Our thoughts are with them and the entire Navy and Marine Corps family. Now, Mr. Spencer, in recent years, there have been a number of reports of workplace safety violations at the private shipyards that the Navy relies on to build its fleet. And in fact, according to federal labor statistics, shipyard workers face an injury and illness rate that is roughly 80% higher than the construction industry generally. And the list of reported injuries and violations that these workers are exposed to is bone-chilling. Amputation, electrocution, suffocation, falls, explosions, chemical burns, cancer-causing fumes. The Navy is spending hundreds of billions of dollars at shipyards where workers are routinely injured and maimed because of lax safety standards. But a Navy spokesman responded to those concerns by saying, and I'm going to quote the spokesman, "We are not the overlords of private shipyards when it comes to workplace safety." Mr. Spencer, do you agree with this attitude?
No, I can't, Senator. I truly believe that as we go forward in today's environment, and we're talking about, in the case of shipbuilding, amping up the production and the throughput, we have to have a sustainable environment. That does not support a sustainable environment. I would hope it would be a whole-of-government solution. I think that OSHA is probably involved. But we look forward to making sure that we are good stewards of resources.
Good. And so do I hear you saying that if confirmed, You will commit to looking into how the Navy tracks and monitors workplace safety violations at the shipyards that it's doing business with?
Yes, Senator.
Good. You know, we're talking about growing the fleet to a 355-ship Navy, which would result in considerably more volume at many of these shipyards, and I think the least we can do is make sure that American workers who are employed in those shipyards and are building those ships are afforded reasonable protections going forward.
I concur, Senator.
Thank you. I have another question I want to ask you about. The Navy operates on the front lines of the threats posed by climate change, including rising sea levels and floods, more intense storms, higher temperatures. The Navy has long recognized the risks posed by climate change. Back in 2010, the Navy released a climate change roadmap which observed, and I'm going to quote here, "Climate change is a national security challenge with strategic implications for the Navy. It is affecting and will continue to affect U.S. military installations and access to natural resources worldwide. It will affect the type, scope, and location of future Navy missions." Mr. Spencer, do you believe that climate is changing and that climate change will continue to affect the Navy's installations and missions?
Senator, the Navy, from my briefings to date, is totally aware of rising water issues, storm issues, et cetera. We must protect our infrastructure, and I will work hard to make sure that we are keeping an eye on that, because without the infrastructure, we lose readiness.
So I take that as a yes?
Yes, all about readiness.
Good. And if confirmed under your leadership, will the Navy prepare for climate change? I think this is where you were going about readiness. And I want to say that both in terms of preparing our own bases and installations and preparing for the crises and the insecurity that climate change will exacerbate around the world.
Yes, Senator.
Good. You know, in his farewell speech in front of sailors and Marines, former Navy Secretary Mabus warned that if we fail to act upon climate change, instability around the globe will inevitably intensify, and even our bases will risk being lost. I think he's right, and I will be counting on you, Mr. Spencer, to carry on where Secretary Mabus left off and to ensure that we adapt to this threat and we are ready.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Spencer, congratulations to you and your family, and appreciate your desire to serve your country again. I wanted to get back to the issue that I think was lost by the last Secretary of the Navy, and I want to associate my concerns that Senator Cotton raised about your predecessor, who took his eye off the ball on many things, readiness, but particularly training. To that list that Senator Cotton mentioned, the previous Secretary of the Navy gave the Commandant of the Marine Corps an order to integrate boot camp in 2 weeks. He said, have this done in 2 weeks. The most ridiculous order I've seen as a member of this committee by anyone in the military. So I want to get a sense of your view on training, on hard, rigorous training. There's been a lot of focus on Korea in the last several months. Members of this committee, myself included, have a lot of concerns. Have you read the book This Kind of War by T.R. Fehrenbach?
I've not.
So I think that's something, I have an extra copy I'd love for you to take a look at. It's all about the Korean War and our lack of training and our lack of readiness and what it did to the men and women in the Marines and the Army who had to go fight. And it's a really, really dire situation. As described in the book, because thousands of Americans were killed in the summer of 1950 because they weren't trained and they weren't hard and they weren't ready to fight. Could you just give me a sense of your philosophy on training sailors and Marines? You know, unfortunately, just in the last month, we've had accidents at sea. We've a lot of talk and concern about what happened with the refueling tanker just yesterday. What is your view on how we should be training our Marines and sailors?
Senator, it's my point of view, and if confirmed, the tone will be set from the Secretariat's office, that we are all here for one purpose, and that's the pointy end of the spear. all urgency, all focus, whether a dental hygienist, whether motor pool, whether pilot, whether flag officer, we are all here to attain the goal, and the goal is to deliver the fight. We have to train. It's mandatory. The CRs, the BCA has really cut into training, and I think we're seeing some of the impact of that, unfortunately. We need to turn that around and correct it immediately.
Well, I think sometimes, and I'm looking forward to your confirmation, you'll see that even this committee puts forward issues and areas of focus that don't relate to training. And if you see that happens too much, you count me as one of the supporters to get back to what you're talking about, which is serious, hard training so our men and women can come home if and when they have to go to war.
Yes, sir.
You and I had a good discussion about an issue that's taken up a lot of time in the committee with regard to Arctic strategy, and whether it's the new Arctic strategy that the Secretary of Defense put forward, or Admiral Stavridis recently put out a book on sea power, had a whole section on Arctic strategy. Are you familiar with the new DoD's Arctic strategy?
I have read it, sir.
And part of that strategy talks about the ability to conduct FONOPs. And yet, last month, Admiral Richardson said that it's absolutely true we don't have the capacity or capability to conduct any FONOPs in the Arctic. So we have a strategy that says we need to do something, and we have the CNO of the Navy saying we don't have the means to actually do it. So there's two areas I would like to get your commitment to work with this committee on, if confirmed. First, as we look at a 355-ship Navy, in order to ensure that we can have the capability to conduct FONOPs in the Arctic, can you take a hard look at the issue of ice hardening our ships, which at a Sea Power Subcommittee just 2 weeks ago, the Navy indicated they're not looking at that issue at all.
Senator, when it comes to one of my priorities, if confirmed, you heard me talk about capabilities, and that would fall squarely underneath that.
And then just 2 weeks ago, again, this committee in the NDAA put forward language that authorizes the procurement of up to 6 icebreakers. Right now, the United States has 2. One is broken. If you actually go out to Seattle, where they're home based, these are Coast Guard icebreakers. I would recommend you do it because it's kind of a sad affair. We have men and women in the Coast Guard wearing the uniform of the United States deploying on ships that were commissioned over 40 years ago and are really barely seaworthy. So there's been a bit of a back and forth, and you and I have discussed this, between who's responsible for that, the Coast Guard or the Navy. Can I get your commitment to take a hard look at the Navy and Coast Guard's cooperation in order to enable our country to procure icebreakers, which the CNO of the Navy said it's absolutely in the national interest of the United States to have more than one icebreaker. The Russians have 40. They're building 13 more, several of which are nuclear powered. Can I get your commitment to work with the Coast Guard and this committee on that important task?
Most definitely, Senator. If I'm not mistaken, you all have provided some money for the Navy to provide support for the Coast Guard in the exploration of the next generation of icebreaker, and that's totally supportive in my mind.
Great. Thank you.
On behalf of the chairman, Senator Wicker, please.
Thank you, Mr. Spencer. I've been in and out, and it seems that you're doing well, and I think I intend to join a unanimous committee in supporting your confirmation. Let me say 2 things. Please know, as our future Secretary of the Navy, that this committee is serious about helping you and helping President Trump get to the 355 ship fleet. We've had over time, since I was in the House of Representatives, goals that we never quite got to. It was 308, it was 313. Here we are at 276 ships in our fleet. We have language in the DOD bill, and our House counterparts have language in the NDAA over there, indicated to show you we're serious. And frankly, we think we've got you the money this first year to get us on the path to 355 ships. So please know that we're serious about this, and we want to be your teammates there. Let me ask you my one question about the physiological episodes that are occurring to our pilots, particularly our training pilots in the T-45 at the 3 undergraduate pilot training bases. I've learned more in the last 4 or 5 months about hypoxia than probably is wise for someone of my educational attainment. But I've learned that there are many types of hypoxia, but the real problem with the training planes and our 3 pilot training stations is the histotoxic hypoxia, and try as we might with the best minds in the Navy and the federal government, we haven't gotten to a correct diagnosis. And the best I've heard is that we can maybe patch together a halfway of a solution here and with a bit of a solution there and get us back to flying at the correct altitudes that we need to train these men and women to do the hard work that is expected of them. And you've already testified in answer to Senator Ernst's question that that these PE physiological episodes will remain a top priority. Thank you for that. We put a little something in the bill that I want to draw your attention to, and I hope it stays in the bill and is signed by the President. And it basically says, while we're putting the best minds of the government at work, the Navy and DOD can, if they want to, not forced to, but can, if they want to, implement a prize competition. Now, you come from the private sector, sir, and all we're doing is saying, after the best minds that we have in the federal government have tried and so far haven't found the exact diagnosis of what the problem is that causes this histotoxic hypoxia, we could offer a prize to anyone in the country, anyone on the face of the globe for that matter, and you don't pay the money unless you get a solution. So I would just urge you to, I would urge my colleagues to let's keep that in the bill and treat it seriously. And I would urge you, after you're confirmed, and if we don't get to a solution, which I certainly hope we get to a solution quickly, but if we don't, take this provision seriously, and let's unleash the brain power of the entire country and the entire globe to try to get to the solution. So whatever thoughts you might have on that statement in 1 minute, I would be happy to hear.
Senator, very exciting, Chapter 1 of Thinking Outside the Box. That's fantastic to hear, and it excites me that those tools and authority would be available to us.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you. Congratulations, Ms. Spencer. This will be a real honor, and I appreciate you being willing to serve. I keep hearing from junior officers in particular the security clearance backlog. You know, everybody's asking you to look at everything. Could you please look at that issue? It is taking an inordinate amount of time for people to get their security clearances, and a lot of jobs are being unfilled, and people are not able to do the job adequately without security clearance. So if you need more help from the committee, if you need more money, more resources, please let us know.
Most definitely, Senator. Having been a product of going through that, I know exactly what they're facing.
It's I don't know what's going on out there. It's the policy of the Trump administration to deny North Korea the capability to hit the American homeland with a nuclear-tipped ICBM. Do you agree with that policy?
Yes.
And one of the challenges for the Navy is how they avoid that if it ever came about. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
All right, so when you look at force structure and the number of ships, it's got to really be based on threats. When you look at the world from a Navy point of view, how would you say the world is in terms of a threat metrics for the Navy? Is there a need for more ships?
There definitely, Senator. The matrix of threats we're facing now from the 4+1, however you want to define it, is one of the more complex that the country's ever faced. We need the capability. We need the capacity.
Would you say this is one of the more challenging times for the United States Navy since World War II?
I would say it is.
would you say it'd be a really bad idea for the Congress to cut the Navy's budget?
A really bad idea, Senator.
Sequestration is an idea that needs to be set aside?
Yes, Senator.
Okay. In terms of how the military services work, about 50% of all cost are personnel costs. Do you understand that?
Yes, Senator.
We have done on this committee some pretty, I think, creative things to lower personnel costs but be fair to the force. We want to be generous to those who serve the country. God knows they deserve it. We want to be fair and generous to those who retire. But we got to look at everything, including personnel costs, to have a sustainable budget. Do you agree with that?
Totally, Senator.
TRICARE. TRICARE is a part of the Department of Defense's budget that's growing exponentially. It is health care for the military service members and their family, and everybody gets that. But on the retiree part, we haven't really had a premium adjustment of any significance since 1995. Are you willing to work with this committee to make TRICARE generous but more sustainable?
Yes, Senator.
How do you view that part of the budget over time?
Oh, that's one of our biggest challenges right now. The personnel factor is growing at an unsustainable rate. I mean, the discretionary budget is being eaten up by personnel costs. We owe our uniformed members and our retirees the best that we can offer. We're going to have to think of different ways to deliver just as good, if not better, services.
A Navy SEAL is one of the finest members of the force anywhere, a very elite group of warfighters. You have people in the cyber arena. Do you agree that cyber threats to the military are growing, not lessening?
Exponentially, Senator.
So how do we keep the Navy SEAL on track for a 20 or 30-year career when they can leave the Navy and probably make 4 times what they make in the Navy as a contractor? How do we attract the best minds in the cyber arena? They could go to Silicon Valley. How do we do that? And you don't have to give me a complete answer, but I'd like for you to think about that, because the competition for these really high-skilled warfighters is immense. And any thoughts on that?
Senator, again, my priorities being people, capacity, and process. People are number one, and we are going to have to take every single best practice we can find from within the government, from the private sector, to address the situation you just mentioned, whether it be a SEAL, whether it be our cyber experts. We're going to have to find a flexible way to allow people in the cyber field to leave and come back, because I believe they have to be refreshed in their own community. And I look forward to working with you all to think outside the box on how we can do this.
And finally, sexual harassment and abuse of service members. This committee spent a lot of time and attention of trying to change the law and the culture. What is your view of that situation, and where do you want to take the Navy when it comes to sexual harassment and sexual assault?
Senator, one is too many. But let's know that the job of the Navy Marine Corps team is to inflict pain to the enemy, unsustainable pain to the enemy. When I see that we're inflicting pain upon ourselves, it's an anathema to me, and it must be stopped.